Hello, I came to talk to you again and offer some tales from Kalamazoo County, Waukesha Township. Time period on the board, 1939 to 1935. Hence, the intention is to describe this from memory, events from a youth between the ages 5 and 10. Last time we talked about the one-room country school and the importance of the town hall and election day in a rural community with small towns. Today, I would like to talk to you about gardens and maybe, if we have the time, about butchering day, one of the most important days for a young boy. It would be the second most important, probably threshing day, because that did occur in the summertime and life was more pleasant in the summertime than in the wintertime. When I think of the topic we are discussing here, gardens, and particularly the truck garden, a large one for canning purposes, I often think what happens to my students when I say something such as, well, today we'll take up the topic in the high Middle Ages of the transfer from the two-field system to the three-field system. And I can imagine their reaction. They would rather talk about King Richard and the Crusades. But either way, it's an important development. And in this case, these are merely from my memory and incidents in my youth. Now, a farm at this time period, and remember, we're right at the last days of the Great Depression and moving into changes and all of that, because by 1941 we are at war. But the Depression still exists in the United States at that time. So things are sparse and tight, economically speaking. Farmers would attempt to make and to grow any and all things that they possibly could. That means a lot of older sisters, a lot of help shared between farm wives, one and the other, is going to involve a lot of canning in one way or another to prepare the foods that you would use during the winter, which will be stored in a cellar, and we will discuss that cellar. Now, most farms at that time would have had two gardens. One would lay exactly behind the house or adjacent, but very close to the house, and that's where you would grow either delicate crops, such as strawberries, and tomatoes, some tomatoes, and also you would have those things that you would eat and consume during the summer at the table. A good example would be sweet corn, and when it came due and you planted it differently than you did in the large truck garden at an earlier time, so that when it came due you ate all of it at the table. It would not be unusual at all for a farm table with 8 people eating at it to have 2 or 3 platters of sweet corn on the table at lunchtime and at dinner time until you'd consumed the corn. For person to eat 2 or 3 years with their meal would be very, very common. And of course it was picked and husked probably within half an hour before it went into the boilers. So everything would be fresh in that sense. The smaller garden that lay adjacent to the house, you would use not a tractor, but the horse that you'd retained when you moved to the tractor era. Because a horse is very handy, can be turned around easily, does not pack down the ground as much. And so you can move into those areas. It's very important for a smaller garden. But as I say, there would be cabbage there, tomatoes, radishes, carrots, all the things of that type, plus some sweet corn. You might have a few sunflowers there. That's where you might have the trellises for some grapes as they came due each year. And also directly behind your outdoor toilet, growing right next to it at the rear, would be the rhubarb. Need good, rich, juicy soil to grow the rhubarb, which certainly dresses up other items that you might have. Apple and rhubarb pie and strawberry and rhubarb pie. Tastes very, very good. So that would be used, and immediately most everything would be consumed immediately except for the strawberries, and many of the strawberries, of course, would be canned. That area where all the strawberries might be, would be covered with a heavy coating of straw in the fall, so that during the winter, snow would lay on the straw and you would protect the plants in that fashion. And then when everything thawed in the spring, obviously the straw decomposed and you had the benefit of all of that. Now, the garden that was most important for retention and moving through the winter, of course, is called the truck garden or truck patch. And I think you're familiar with the term patch. If you've read Uncle Remus or heard the stories, don't throw me in that briar patch. But patch is a logical term if you're talking about a farm that has 200 acres and you choose one corner of a 20-acre field. and you have only 2 acres, let's say, or something almost the size of a football field in which you are planting items which you will retain in some form or another through the winter. Also, it's important from a youth's point of view because the youth are very much involved in the activities. The truck patch would include, because of its space, the area in which you would plant what you call cantaloupes. We call them muskmelons in southern Michigan. And you wouldn't put watermelons there. That's another story, watermelons. That's a special issue. And you would put cucumbers because it takes an expanse. Squash of one kind or another takes a large expanse. And then you would put several long rows of sweet corn, and you would also plant several long rows of popcorn. That was the most important as far as I was concerned. Then also in that truck patch, you would have several long rows of potatoes. And you retained those potatoes that made it through the winter in the bins in your cellar, which had a temperature that did not vary greatly because you had concrete and block or stone walls. And so in the summertime, it probably never rose above 53, 54 degrees in the cellar. And in the wintertime, it did not freeze, but of course was much colder. Those potatoes that you retained through the winter were your seed potatoes. And on the day that potatoes were planted, of course, the soil was already prepared. You could use a tractor for that, then cultipack, then drag. The soil is soft, delicate, ready to go. And then my father, early in the morning, would cut up the potatoes. And you must cut the potatoes so that each piece of potato that you have has an eye in it, because that's where they will sprout. Then we would go out to the truck patch with all these potatoes in 5-gallon containers. And my brother and I, as small boys, able to go barefooted because of this operation, would plant the potatoes. And it would be done the following way. My father would take the horse and cut furrows with a kind of a V-shaped blade, 14 inches deep, but no wider than this, and move all the way down the row, turn the horse around, do the same thing again until he had the rows prepared. Then my brother and I would take an ample amount in bags, and we would walk the rows. And every 18 inches, we would drop a potato and immediately catch it so that it didn't bounce away with our bare feet. So it was planted in that fashion. Once each row had potatoes everywhere, and from each one of these chunks of potato, you probably would receive 6 or 8 potatoes at the time that they were harvested in the fall. So that being done, then my father would hook a contraption to the horse, which was a reversed V of this fashion, 2x10 wood with a platform across it. My brother and I would sit on it to hold it down, and he would pull it with the horse in reverse fashion, and it would pull all the furrow on each side into the hole as you went down the entire strip. So the potatoes would be covered. That's the operation there. With regard to harvesting those potatoes, we're waiting until the fall in which the vines are totally dead, laying flat on the soil, and then you take a 5-tine pitchfork, spear the ground very carefully so you don't ruin any potatoes, and start lifting them up. And then you shake all the dirt off the potatoes and leave them there for a couple of hours in the sunshine. And then you come back and put them in large burlap bags, and you carry them home or into the house, then into the cellar. Cellar opens from the outside, and there you would have 2 large bins. And you would use potatoes out of one bin first, and when that one was empty, then you had a second bin where you could move potatoes from one to the other, because along about springtime, those potatoes will realize they're a vegetable, and they will start sprouting. So before you use up all of them and before you plant again, you'll need to have a little project of 2 young boys sitting in the cellar on cans sprouting all the potatoes, and this will have to be done 2 or 3 times as you move on into spring and as you approach May. So the potatoes are very, very important, and young people were involved in it. Attending a one-room country school, the potatoes had to be planted at the time that my father indicated was essential, and he always looked at the moon to do that. I paid very little attention to the moon except on Halloween and other times that, but Either way, he always took a sign of the moon for planting the potatoes. So we might be held out of school one forenoon for that particular special operation. You ate the cantaloupes as they were and brought them out, but the watermelons you wouldn't put there because they were too conspicuous, and there was a game that farm boys always played, and every adult farmer knew, because he did it when he was a boy, that there's such a thing as searching out to find someone's watermelon patch. Not that you don't have them yourself. That's not the point at all. The point is to discover where it is and play a little game of hiding. And my oldest brother often left a quarter of an acre in the center of a cornfield, and we planted the watermelons there. And then as the corn came up and became higher, melons grew wonderfully, and you couldn't see them from any particular direction. We've even put them in the corn rows, and they just wend their way around the corn stalks here and there. And so it wouldn't be unusual at all for us to have a crop of 100 watermelons, and you could eat them every day until you had consumed them. The same with the cantaloupes. The truck patch would also include onions that would be used, extra cabbage. My mother made a chowder that was chopped onions, cabbage, pickles, and other things of that type. Now, one of the special items that came out of that truck patch was the sweet corn, and it was not for the table directly at the time it was harvested. And it also was the basis for my mother's preparation of what is called scalloped corn, and I have never, since I left the farm, been able to taste scalloped corn with the flavor of my mother's, because it's not made that way anymore, and it's very difficult to do. What would happen is this: a couple of other farm ladies would come by to help my mother on the day in which we were harvesting all the sweet corn. And they would sit at a giant table, and they would each have a cutting board, and they would have sharp butcher knives. And we would then collect the corn, husk it, bring it into them in large tubs. They would take it and run the butcher knife right down the cob in this fashion, around and around and around until it was completely cleared. Toss the cob aside, and then they had all of these kernels that had been cut off the ear. My mother then had what you would call a flat double boiler, which would be as large as the area in front of me here. So it could be 3 feet by 3 feet. And it would easily cover all 4 burners on a standard cook stove. It was about this tall, with a lip this high running around it, but the remaining area that was concealed, you could fill with water in a little opening in the corner. So you ended up with this much water, and then you spread the top with corn, fresh corn. And then you just let it boil and simmer all day until the corn on top was so dry that if you put it in a jar, the jar would rattle like you had a jar full of peanuts. That corn then was taken to the cellar and placed on shelves and dried. The can wasn't completely full, but my mother always put it in 2-quart mason jars because we had a large family and you would never make less than the 2-quart jar corn. Then during the wintertime, she would take that out, and on the stove with fresh cream from our own cows, fresh butter that we churned ourselves, chopped onions and other spices, she would then mix it all together to a kind of creamy mass, reconstitute it, and then bake it. When you're through, it's as solidified as scalloped potatoes, but it has a different flavor. And you can't take cream corn or just plain corn and do that and have that flavor. It just works out differently. It has kind of a brownish rust color when it's completed. And very, very good. So there are some substitutes that you just can't find unless you do it in that particular fashion. Another type of corn, of course, is the popcorn. And that would have been of most interest to my brother and I at our age. And we weren't we could be involved in the planting of that, but then you left it in the field until all the stalks were brown and dry. And then you went out when the corn was dry and very hard. And a popcorn ear is only about this long, about this big round. And what you would do is usually each stalk had 2 ears. And so you would go down the rows and you would take the ears and you would pick them, then strip the husk, the dry, brittle husk back, and then you would tie them together in a knot. Now you have, if you pick it up from the husk, 2 ears of popcorn hanging. You would never take the popcorn, or we didn't, ever take it off the cob. until we popped it. And then we would go to a very dry place, such as the attic, up high. Heat rises, doesn't it? And then across the rafters of the attic, we would loop these corn in twos all the way across. And then on the particular day when you wanted some popcorn, all you did was go to the attic, lift off the number that you needed, shell it into a bowl, and my mother would pop the corn in a gigantic iron skillet with homemade butter, of course. Not so good for you, maybe, with a lid, and she would shake it, and then she would pour it into dish pans that probably hold 3 gallons. If it were a summer day and she made the popcorn, it was most likely because rain drove you from the fields. It wasn't time to do chores yet. You were confined, so you're sitting on a screened-in porch looking at Life magazine, Look magazine, Collier's, something of that type, or you're playing checkers or a card game of one kind or another until about 4:30 when it's time to feed the animals and commence with the milking. That was nice, and I always associated rain in the summertime and popcorn. And as I raised my own children in Tempe, Arizona, they took on that flavor from me. And one day, when my daughter was in about the 4th grade, it rained here during warm weather, and I was at home, and she came home from school and said, "Where's the popcorn?" Because she had been psychologically conditioned to assume that if it rained, I would definitely make popcorn. The other time when you consume the largest amount of popcorn, and this is probably the most, is on cold winter days when everyone is in on a Sunday afternoon after church. And you would have your large meal about 1:30 or 2, and then you didn't have a Sunday evening meal in most cases. In the summertime, it was just vegetables and fresh things. And in the wintertime, quite often, it was popcorn and apples, which you also stored in the cellar. And so the popcorn would be brought down. My mother would make maybe 2 huge dish pans of popcorn. My older brothers and sisters would have friends over. They would be playing Monopoly, checkers, or something in the house. There might be 15 people in the house. So you need 3-gallon at least dish pans of popcorn. And as a special treat, my mother had a mixture of sorghum and molasses that she would use on another dish pan full, and she would make popcorn balls. That was a special treat, and that didn't happen very often. But either way, it was very, very beneficial. So the cellar was a very, very important item in all of these cases. Very, very important. And 2 large doors open from the outside. You get the impression it's something like Dorothy in Kansas, and a good place that you would want to hide if you had a severe storm, as was faced in The Wizard of Oz. Cold, dank, and it wasn't until I was about 8 or 9 that we had central heating. That was in another part of the cellar, well walled off so that none of the heat could come into the area where we stored all of the other cans of one kind or another. Canning was very, very important. We had 2 pear trees. Off from the pear trees, we could probably gain maybe 8, 9, 10 large burlap bags of pears, and my mother would can somewhere between 50 and 60 quarts of pears. And those, of course, are canned and then put in large boilers, and then the lid sealed after the pears have been cooked. And then when they cool, you seal the lid, and you take them down and put them in the proper place in the cellar. We did not grow peaches, but my older brother would join with other farmers, and they would take a truck and drive to the marine west coast climate on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan near Benton Harbor, and bring back peaches in large wicker-type bushel baskets. And they would bring back enough so that my mother could always can at least 100 quarts of peaches. Her record one year was 142 quarts of peaches. So all of this is very, very important, and of course we haven't even mentioned the number of pickles that will be prepared, both dill and sweet, chopped cauliflower, the beets from the garden. And beets were very, very important, not only because you could eat the beets, but if they were in a 2-quart jar, when you had consumed half of the beets with all that purple beet juice in there, then you could take and boil eggs, and you drop the eggs into the jar of beet juice, and you pickle the eggs. So you give another flavor to the egg, and it makes them a little bit special. Of course, you shell them first. And we're not talking about Easter time. So that was another practice. So either way, you made the best use of the truck garden as you possibly could. And as I say, the size is large, and it involves a tremendous amount of work. None of this was irrigated. This was strictly dry farming, as all Michigan farming was at that time. Under weather conditions, there never seemed to be a serious difficulty with growing things in that fashion. I'll tell you one watermelon story. Watermelon are very, very important, and they are delicious, as you know. But during the season, you can, of course, have all the watermelon that you want if you're growing them in that fashion. But the practice of hunting for other people's watermelon was very, very common. And by the time I was 11, I would join with individuals who were older when we went to a softball game at a local town on a Tuesday night or something of this type, and when watermelons were in season. And we would try to devise or predict, ascertain where particular farmers had their watermelon patch. And one farmer I liked very much because he would always challenge us at Farm Bureau picnics and say, well, you'll never find them this year. You'll never find them. And he would challenge us in this fashion. Of course, as if he caught you in his watermelon patch, he would probably give you a tongue lashing, take you up to the house, and send you home with a watermelon. After all, you can't carry very many watermelons away, and if somebody has 150 of them, there's no serious damage done, but the fun of hunting them, that is there. And I got into trouble for the only time that I think I ever had any contact with the police, and it had to do with watermelons. And a gentleman, son of another farmer, who was old enough to have a driver's license, and he had their flatbed Ford truck. And we went to a softball game, 4 of us crowded into the cab, and we took along some burlap bags because he pointed out that along a road leading to Kalamazoo, someone had planted all of their watermelons just 40 steps from the road. And we wondered, why would anyone do that? And we had to conclude that obviously whoever lived there had never grown up on a farm, and that this was a garden. And we found out later that it was a rural home that a woman had used to establish a rest home for the elderly, and she put out a large garden for the table. But we couldn't imagine anyone planting watermelons where they could be seen from a driving car. So we decided that we would have a few and eat them after the softball. We'd go pick them up after the softball game and then eat them sitting right on the steps of the only store in Fulton, leave the rinds for evidence to allow everyone to know that we had a victory the night before. We found a patch. Of course, we really didn't have to do much to find this patch. The problem was that someone had gone into that patch the night before, not rural people, but from the local town of Vicksburg, a town of about 1,800, and caused damage. We did not know that, and so when we stopped the truck and 2 of us went into the patch with burlap bags, and the melons would be so large the most we could carry would be 3 melons apiece. And once in there, all of a sudden a voice comes from across the road from a local farmer who's helping this lady out because of what happened to her patch the night before. And he shouts and he fires a shotgun into the air, and of course I was stunned. And the other young man with me dropped his sack, I dropped my sack, and we took off straight ahead as fast as we could toward a cornfield, which would have been green corn at that time, but tall, at least 7 feet high. And we ran through the cornfield and then moved out on a side road and waited for our compatriot to come by in his flatbed truck and pick us up. He led the farmers a merry chase, finally came whizzing down the road. We jumped out of the ditch. He picked us up, but one of our members had not been picked up. So he circled the 1-mile section 2 or 3 times. In the meantime, the woman who owned the property called the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department. And as we passed a particular corner and turned around in someone's driveway to come back, 3 police cars moved across the road with flashing lights. I couldn't have swallowed 1 kernel of wheat at that time. So we faced this prospect with all the flashing lights, and then the police took us one at a time and interrogated us. Now, we haven't robbed a bank, as you understand, and we are playing a game that all farmers know. But not this lady. She did not understand it that way, and of course, county sheriff people are generally from the city of Kalamazoo, and they don't play the game either. I was interrogated alone in the rear of the police car, and they kept saying things like, "How old are you again? 11? Oh, you'll fit in just fine at that school of detention that we have up there in Kalamazoo. You'll fit in just fine." And I could barely talk. I was so frightened. But eventually, they let us out, and they indicated, we all got back in the truck, and they told us to be in Kalamazoo at the county courthouse, 9 o'clock sharp, and we would see a judge. So we went home. Needless to say, no one had any sleep. And we didn't return home until about 2:30 in the morning. And then the next morning, the same gentleman with his flatbed truck picked us up, and we all went to Kalamazoo. Left the truck. Here was the lady that owned the farm standing there. She said, "Shame on you boys, bunch of thieves." Well, she was right. Technically, that is absolutely the case, even though we felt we were playing one of the traditional games. Then we sat down before the judge without the lady present. And the judge went on to say, and he was a fellow only about 40, 35 or 40. He said, "I'd like you to know that I grew up in a rural area." He named the township where he grew up, and he said, "We used to play the games of watermelons when I was a boy." He said it was a lot of fun, and I don't think it should be stopped. However, you chose a lady who has no background on a farm. She doesn't know the game like we all do. And even though, as you point out, the damage was done the night before, either way, you were in the patch, and we have caught you for being in the patch. He says, now, the lady, in her opinion, feels that the damage to melons done by the people the night ahead of us, and we don't have those people, is about $50. Well, the older fellow that had the flatbed truck had taken money with him. We didn't have enough money for that. None of us had more than $1 or $2. But then, it cost about 16 cents to go to a movie at that time. But $2 is a lot of money. So he paid the fine. And he says, "We won't keep any record of this as long as you've made up for the melons that have been damaged." So we went back to the truck, and now we are farm boys, and we are in the big city. Kalamazoo probably had 60,000 people, had 7 moving picture shows. And now it's only 10 o'clock in the morning, so we're in town, so we strolled around Kalamazoo until the 1 o'clock movies came on, and all went to see some good movie like Boston Blackie on one, and Roy Rogers in the other feature, and then jumped back in the flatbed, proceeded on home, where on the way home, from a ditch, we picked up 15 melons we had stored from 2 other expeditions earlier that month. Took those on home, and then eventually we all had to come up with our $10 apiece to pay the gentleman who had furnished the $50. I never discussed this with my family in any way, but my older brother knew exactly what happened because he was in close contact with individuals his age, and there were plenty of county workers that drove trucks, and there was plenty of gossip between county officials one way or another about what's happening in this region of the county or another. So that was something that was known to my brother, and he is 76 today, and he often reminds me would I like, if visiting Michigan, to go out and scout for some watermelons, which isn't necessary, of course, because he always has a watermelon patch himself. Now, also close to the house, we talked about the preparation of peaches and pears. Close to the house, there would be a variety of 3 types of plums, and those trees were always in an area where there was grass, but hogs could graze there because when plums fell that were in some way damaged in any way, the hogs would eat them, and the hogs, powerful jaws that they have, can also chew the seeds. So my mother made jams and jellies and also canned plums, and could use to make pies and other things during the winter. And we also had several apple trees, 2 or 3 different varieties, and they were very important, especially for youth, because as apples fell off the tree, if you picked them up immediately, and then if you picked the others when they were mature, you could take a pickup truck, you could take maybe 10 or 12 burlap bags filled with apples, and you could go to a local cider press. And when you were and you would also take 10-gallon milk cans with you, so that with those bags of apples you might come home with 2 10-gallon cans of fresh apple cider, which you tried to consume as fast as you could because it starts getting bitter within a week. Now, a cider press looks like the one that I experienced. Looks like racks, like the borders that you would have around a screen that you would put on a window. But instead of screen being between the boards, there was heavy wire, squares this big, and then layered on both sides with burlap. All of it tacked to the sides. And then a large square area like a printing press, because you're going to drive down these 4x4 screens with the burlap, and you're going to layer them. And so you're going to pour in a layer of apples and put a screen on. And then you're going to pour in another layer of apples and put this screen on. And you'll go up to maybe 10 or 12 of them. And of course the wood is only this thick. And then the giant press will be brought down, and out of a spigot will pour all the juice from the apples right into a 10-gallon can. So it doesn't take very long. They're pressed in that fashion, and the remainder of the apples can be used for fertilizer and enrichment of the soil in other ways. Then you would bring the 10-gallon cans home, set them on a cool porch, have 2 dippers hanging close by, and individuals would probably drink cider 20 times a day as they passed. It's kind of rough on the system the first 2 days, but then you adjusted to it. Otherwise, there wasn't a way of keeping it and have it taste fresh. You can always have it homogenized or boiled in some way, but then it doesn't have the same flavor it does when it's pristine fresh. That was a very common thing to do when the Young Farm Bureau would plan a picnic or a barn dance or something of that type. And individuals would get together with their trucks, have lots of cider pressed, and there might be 6 cans, 10-gallon cans of cider, and individuals would dip it out into cups during the barn dance, and that would be the basic fluid beverage available. Then there would be donuts and pretzels and other things of that type at a barn dance. But the cider, very, very important, and it's rare when you can find a place today where the cider has been pressed within 24 hours and not tampered with in any way. It has a very, very special flavor. So the truck patch, very, very important to youth, and youth very, very much involved in it. Now, of the days that I was talking about on a farm, which would be important days, exciting days for a young person who is 7 or 8 years of age, the second most important or exciting would be butchering day. Maybe we have time, we'll talk about threshing day. After all, threshing day is important because it creates one of the important institutions on a farm. That's called the straw stack, which can be used for any number of recreational activities. But butchering day was very, very special. And on our farm, we butchered beef at one time, and we also butchered 2 large hogs at another time. This was always done in winter when it was cold, because you needed to be able to hold the meat for several days while carrying out all the preparations so that that meat could be retained in the cellar through the winter, the remainder of the winter, and particularly now through the summer. So you need to prepare all of this. That way you did it always in cold weather. Usually there was snow on the ground. With regard to the skill of butchering, the average farmer did not have that particular skill. But there was always among every 10 farmers one who knew the profession of butchering. Just as there was always one farmer in 10 who had the equipment and the skill to shear sheep. So he sheared, and that was a way of picking up extra money, and he sheared for everyone else. And that way you retained the wool and sold some wool each year. Also, that individual, if you were invited to shear your sheep, you gave him all the help in handling the sheep, furnishing them, holding them, everything else during that day, and he ate a noon meal with you, and he ate an evening meal with you. Standard attitude on a farm was, you don't work anybody and not feed them. It's just not done, unless you're farming on a farm in which there is an elderly person who cannot possibly take care of you, but they're still living on the farm property. You don't ask it then, you take along your picnic goods or whatever you might do. Now back to the butchering day. Cold day might be down to 0. Likely there would be snow on the ground. And the first operation would be for my brother Richard and myself when we were 7, 8. He was 2 years older than me. We would take our respective personal sleds and we would go up to a particular structure on the farm where my father stored gasoline in one part of it, and in the other part cut up rails from old rail fences. Those rails that were collected when you replaced the fences with wire fences. And those rails he retained, cut them up with a buzzsaw, and so one whole end of a building had this ample supply of wood which was never touched at any time except on butchering days. And for that reason, because it was so dry and old, it was burned very, very hot. My brother and I would pile wood on our sleds and pull it maybe 100 yards to the area near the chicken yard where a couple of tripods would be set up, tripods that would be 8 feet high, very large, this big around, made of wood. And we would bring the wood there. Also, out of storage, my father would take 3 large black iron cauldrons that sat on legs about this tall, 4 legs, and those would be hauled also, too heavy for us, hauled also, and they would be placed there. If there's snow, so what? The snow will burn away. And then under each of those, filled with water, they would probably hold 80 gallons of water. They were so large. 2 people could take a bath if they were 8-year-old in one of those cauldrons. And then the fires would be prepared, start burning the water, burning and bubbling the water, so that by the time you reached 8 o'clock, you wanted to make certain that the water was hot enough that you could make spaghetti, pasta in there if you wanted. In the meantime, right, the next operation would be to bring the 2 hogs that you had selected for butchering. And this may sound crude to you, but after all, individuals must prepare their food, and you have to do it in the most convenient way possible. So even though it's startling sometimes to youth to talk about things in this fashion, this is the way it would be done. You would make certain you put plenty of slop in a hog trough so that the 2 hogs that you wanted to butcher that day, and there may be 60 hogs there, you knew exactly which 2 you were going to butcher. The tractor was brought up outside of the hog barn where you had the trough. And then the hog would be stunned by being shot between the eyes while it was eating with a .22 rifle. As it fell to its knees, it was immediately attached to a chain, pulled out by 4 strong men, because the hog might weigh 600 pounds, pulled out into the snow, then chained to the tractor, elevated slightly, and at the same time the farmer, who was the butcher expert, would then stick the hog, which means thrust the knife into the throat area so that he would hit the jugular vein to remove excess blood. The hog would be slightly elevated, and then the tractor would pull it maybe 40 yards to the chicken yard. Then, through a lever arrangement, the hog would be drawn up, lifted, and pulled up by a chain so that it was hanging face down from one of the tripods. Usually you butchered 2 hogs. That's the reason you needed this kind of weather. Now the hog is hanging upside down, bleeding, and the next operation is to get the hair off the hog. Now hogs don't have sweat glands, but so the hair is more easily removed than pin feathers from a chicken. But what you have now is all these cauldrons, 3 of them, with this boiling water that would just sear anything. And then large dippers are taken and tossed on the hog, and it runs down the hog, literally scalding the skin of the hog. And then something shaped like a barbell, only with flat convex blade, circular blade, but not particularly sharp, is used, one on each side, and then as the scalding water runs down the hog, you scrape the side of the hog until you clean the side of the hog so that it's as smooth as Charles Barkley's head. That's what you want to do. Then the butcher will start moving right down the center of the hog, and he will open up the hog completely. Eventually you will have 2 parts hanging there if he's willing to use a saw, and go down the spine, which he could do as well. Any parts that were going to be thrown away would be removed at that time, such as the tail and the ears. Then he would start to work on the hog. The intestines from the hog, right, are removed immediately, and then my mother and 2 or 3 other women would set to work on large boards with the dull edge, the rear edge of a butcher knife, and start scraping all of the excrement out of the intestines. And that was a long operation, and you mustn't use the sharp edge because you must not sever them, because these intestines are going to serve as the casing for your sausage. Furthermore, there's nutrition in the intestines. So they'll be scraped, then they will be put in water, then they will be flushed in hot water, then they'll be scraped again, flushed in hot water, until you have all of this intestine floating in water, all cleaned. Now it's prepared. The casings are prepared. Meanwhile, the butcher is working away, cutting in parts the hog, bit by bit. What is going to be pork steaks are separated. What are going to be pork roasts would be separated. And he also will skin the hog and take out the outer layer, the epidermis, and the fat layer off the hog. That will be placed in sheets, large pieces, and cut up into squares. And while the water cauldron is very hot, and you use one just for this, you take those squares, about this thick, of hog fat with the rind on it, and you toss it into the cauldron. The water is so hot that it'll gradually start shrinking, steam will roll up, and eventually the fat will boil away, and you will end up with what we called cracklins. You buy them in the supermarket today without the rind on, and you call them pork rinds. But the hard part of the rind we left on, and it was no more brittle than a tough pretzel ready to eat. But there were so many of those, if you butchered 2 hogs, that you probably had 4 burlap bags loaded with cracklins. So they didn't become a special treat as such, though you could eat them, just because there were so many of them, and there were so many other things there to eat. Now, in this operation, the more interesting part, of course, was making your sausage. That was by far the most interesting. And it required that you have tubs large enough that 2 people would have to carry them if they're filled or partially filled with meat. And tubs large enough that an 8-year-old boy could easily take a bath in them, large zinc tubs, like a wash tub. And my father had tools on the farm that only came out at this particular time. And one of them was a 6-foot board plank, this thick, about 12 inches wide, and in the center of that, anchored to it with bolts, was a grinder that you worked with by hand. And so all the pork that had been cut up and brought off by the butcher would come into these large tubs, and then my father would start feeding it into the grinder. A different tub would be there to catch all of it that had been ground appropriately to satisfy the needs for the sausage. Then my mother would sprinkle some seasoning on it as it fell in, and then the next operation was to remove that large board and bring another one present. In each case, my brother and I would sit on each one end of the board in order to give it stability. It sat across 2 sawhorses. Then my father had another tool, and it was about this big around and about this tall, and it was a press. It had a lid, threads, and you cranked it down like this, and you filled it with what would be the equivalent of maybe 2 gallons of sausage. And it had an opening at the bottom where all sausage that had been ground would be forced out. So when you put the ground sausage in, then that opening had a little spigot on it that narrowed slightly. And then my father would feed onto the spigot the intestines, maybe 10 feet at a time. And because the intestines are thin, resilient, very tough, slide them on till he had that amount there, and then pull off just enough and pinch it. And then someone would crank. And my father would circle the sausage in one of the large tubs as it squirted out at the bottom, stop there, put in more sausage, we would crank it, more would squirt out, until eventually we had 2 large tubs of sausage, about this big around. You could tell by the casings the hog would have, so intestine filled would be about that big around. Then, that being done, those tubs would be placed there, and if we couldn't prepare all of those today, that's why you do it in the wintertime, those tubs would be taken then to the an outdoor porch where the sausage wouldn't freeze that night, or you could place it in the cellar where there was adequate temperature, and at that time the temperature might be down to 42 degrees, 40 degrees in the cellar, so you can protect the meat. The same true with any hunks that are still hanging. It wasn't unusual when we butchered a cow for my mother, when everything else was prepared, to leave one hind quarter, the hip of the cow, hanging on a porch in the wintertime. And she would just go out with a saw and saw off all she needed to make Swiss steak for that dinner. So that's the way you do it. When you're through, you can obviously use the bone and other things for soups, stews, or from the hog, we would obviously make ham hocks, and my mother would take chunks of pork and cook them the same way. And in each case, same way as the sausage is done, you use a single quart or 2 quart jars for sausage, always 2 quart jars. And the sausage, my mother would take, circle it down into a 2 quart jar to the top, add a little bit of fluid, but not much, and then put the lid on, but not seal the lid. Don't make it tight, it's loose. And then she had large cauldrons, which she filled with water, so that the water came up to the very top of the jar, but wouldn't seep into the jar. And then they were boiled. And she would do some, maybe for 3 days, the stove, wood stove, was operating just boiling the sausage. When it was done, the jars were set aside. You could tell when it was adequately cool because you would see the white lard collect on the top. It kind of sealed right across the top. Then the jars would be tightened, they would go into the basement, and you had the substance for sausage and eggs, sausage and anything throughout the winter. And you took it out 1 jar at a time, therefore it would keep in that fashion, so you might be able to have 3 times a week, sausage out of a 2 quart jar. The best way to retain it. I didn't observe very much in the way of bacon smoking, but I know my father did it in a little hutch that he had. And after the bacon was smoked, I do know that my mother cut it in such a way, she did not have a tool that would cut the rind. So the bacon did not have a tough rind on the end. That had to be removed, and she just cut it this way, and then cut it this way, and lifted the bacon out in that fashion. So the sausage is made, so you have that in the winter. And it fits in for a very, very hearty breakfast, seeing as you probably have, we did, probably 200 chickens, so you ate eggs all the time. You ate chickens every Sunday, and at other times on special occasions. So for that reason, and the sausage is very, very important. The other item that might go with a meal when you're having sausage, if you want a very hearty breakfast, is cornmeal mush. And we had our own hammer mill, but it was not sophisticated enough to grind the flour that my mother would use for her homemade bread. That was done in a different way, and we had to have that done at a special mill. But get back to our sausage. The cornmeal mush we could grind, and it was an excellent substitute for hash brown potatoes and other things that you might eat for body on a cold winter day. The mush my mother prepared with homemade cream, butter, and other things, put it in large flat casserole dishes, and let it solidify. Sufficiently solidified that she could cut it in strips about this thick, about this long, and then she would fry it, just like you would fry potatoes. The outside browned, it became kind of solid in such a way. Some people like something sweet over it, like syrup, and eat it like pancakes. I preferred it with just homemade butter. And then you would eat that alongside some sausage and some eggs to give you body. That could be eaten at any time of the day, and quite often was. It's the same meal that would be used for your cornbread, but not the bread that was used for the household work. That is another topic. And we could move on to that right now, but I think we ought to comment on threshing day as long as we talked about butchering day. Now, though butchering was fun, and to move around here and there and do little errands with your sled and observe all that's going on, and eating fresh cracklings when they happen to be ready, and do all the other things with all the busy work going on with 3 extra household wives of someone else helping your mother in the house, and a nice meal prepared, and maybe some of the kids of those women would come over and you'd do things in the snow, have a good time. It was winter, and so that makes it very different than in the summer. And in the summertime, we threshed until I was about 6 years old. By the time I was 7 or 8, we had a combine. So that eliminated all the benefits of having that many hired hands or cooperating farmers on your property in a single day. Because you see, if someone brings a large threshing rig to your property, you may thresh for 2 days in good summer weather. That would mean the threshing crew that comes with it may have 4 young men who are nice and strong, and they work permanently. That's their job in the summertime, working with the threshing rig. Then, of course, there would be a half a dozen other farmers that would come to help you because you're going to go and help them when they thresh, and you're going to move around the neighborhood, 12 miles here, 2 miles there, and everybody cooperates and helps each other, and you save money on that, of course. The only person you have to pay is the man who owns the rig for use of his large Baker engine that he used to turn the belt that runs all the pulleys and things in the rig, as well as is strong enough to cause straw to blow out one end of the threshing machine through a long blower, which is tended by an individual sitting up on top, and he's the man who blows the straw in such a way when it's brought in that it will form a nice even straw stack of good size. So there are plenty of people there. And the nice thing for youth, if you are too young to have the kind of chores in which you would work on the threshing rig because you're only 6 or 7, then, of course, women who came to help your mother or men who were helping on the threshing rig might bring along their son or daughter that's the same age that you are. And if that's the case, then you might have 5 or 6 other kids on your farm that day, which made a wonderful festival type, almost like a picnic day with all the activity. You could ride on wagons that were bringing in, taking the corn shocks and bundles and the sheaves and bringing them in. You could ride here and there. Your dog was with you. You could watch the straw stack as it began to grow. You could climb up on top and talk to the man who's blowing the straw stack. And others, of course, are taking the grain as it comes out of the threshing machine in bags and setting them in on a wagon, and then the wagon goes to the granary and you start filling bins with wheat, and each time the wheat comes up this way, you put in a new board, and then up this high, a new board until bins might be as tall as 5 feet with nothing but pure wheat in there. You could climb into the bins, and if you had bib overalls on, you could tie the bottom of your bib overalls closed with twine string, and then you could have somebody scoop wheat into your bib overalls until you were the fattest person in the world. You were solid, and you couldn't even bend your legs because you were encased in solid, heavy wheat. Plus, you could always eat the wheat like peanuts, and which we would do. So the movement around the farm and the activity made threshing day, without a doubt, the most important. And I remember one day the individual who was kind of supervising the threshing that day, a fellow named John Shook, whose farm was about 2 miles from our farm, and his brother's the man who owned the threshing rig. And he, during World War II, was our local blackout warden. He had a light that could be seen, couldn't be seen, but would give him some light on his 41 Ford. And he had to move around the area when we had regular blackouts starting in 1942. You might ask yourself, did Michigan farmers in Waukesha Township really feel that Hitler's Stuka bombers were about ready to sweep in? I don't know. I just know that everybody followed the rules and cooperated, and you did have regular rehearsals and blackouts so that no lights were on under any circumstances that could be seen. Either way, John Shuck was a very, very wonderful fellow, and his oldest son was the same age as my oldest brother, and a sister the same age as one of my sisters, and so we knew the farming families very, very well. And one of his favorite things was chicken heart. And for the crews that were working, my mother fixed 2 meals with the help of others and my older sisters, 2 full meals each day they were there. So they ate the noon meal and the evening meal. And there might be 16 males eating at that meal. Others caught their meals here and there. My brother and I always on the side somewhere, not at the table with the men. But my mother had made 6 chickens and dumplings with chicken gravy and mashed potatoes and all the salads, all the other things, plus baked homemade pies. And because John Shook particularly liked chicken heart, about 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 o'clock, my mother called me, and she gave me a little container And she said, I want you to take this out to the field and give it to John Shook because he's a very favored person in our community. And he particularly likes chicken hearts. So when I was about 6, I had the task of delivering chicken hearts to a fellow named John Shook. So it was a very, very sumptuous day, lots of outdoor activity, and you could watch that important straw stack grow as the threshing continued. Now, when it came time to feed all these individuals, there was plenty of help for the cooking, and obviously a large table was set with homemade bread, homemade biscuits, and other things of that type. We'll get to homemade bread in a minute. When the individuals came up to wash up for the noon meal, and your noon meal was dinner, evening meal was supper, there would be 3 tubs, large tubs that would hold 50 gallons apiece, and set up outside, and soap, setting on sawhorses, and individuals would just go down the line and remove their shirts because they were all dusty and caked with the dust of threshing, and lay their hats aside, and then they would rinse and wash in one tub, then take a second rinse in the next tub, and then go to the third tub. Plenty of towels out there, and that's the way they cleaned up for the noon meal, and they did the same in the evening. And that evening meal wouldn't come at 5 or something like that as long as the dew didn't come too early. You might work until 6 or 7. I mean, somebody else has to be milking the cows and doing the standard chores that can never be overlooked. If a cow is to be milked at 5:30 every day, the cow must be milked at 5:30 every day. Otherwise, you will receive less milk, and the cow will adjust to different circumstances and reduce the amount of milk that you might have. So, plenteous meal, plenty to eat. I would say it's a situation where an individual could easily work and consume 9,000 or 10,000 calories a day and easily burn up 8,500 of those calories. If the work is tough, you're out in the field and moving here and there. Now, one other comment at this time, and this will involve the homemade bread. Because we grew wheat, had plenty of wheat, as a matter of fact, we grew corn as well, as you know, oats, clover, timothy hay, alfalfa hay, right, and other items, soybeans, and other items of this type. But bread was very, very important, and as you can gather from now, my mother did a lot of work and a lot of preparing of food rather than purchase it in a store. And as long as she lived on the farm, and she did not leave the farm until 1946, and at that time I was 11, until that time she baked every week bread. So we only purchased what we called store-bought bread, maybe once a week if we ran out. But of course, the number of individuals living at home dwindled by the time I was 11, as it would, because my older brother is 76 today. And individuals go away to do other things. After all, that was World War II, and one brother was obviously off to places like Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, and other places of that type during the war. So he wasn't there after early 1942. But my mother baked each week. And all during this time, it wasn't until I was about 10 that we had a stove that operated on some sort of fuel other than standard firewood. And firewood was always acquired in the winter for drying for the following winter, and you do it during the winter because you can't take time away from harvest with good weather in order to cut wood. So you cut wood when you couldn't do other things during the day between chore time in the morning and chore time in the evening. And most farms of 200 acres or even 160 acres would have at least 10 acres of forest, solid forest. Besides, you had trees along every fence row, down every lane, around your property, and there were walnuts and maple, and we will talk about maple at another time. But let's finish with the homemade bread. And so, with plenty of wheat, my father would merely take a 100-pound grain sack, one of those elite grain sacks that will last a long time if you don't allow mice to nibble holes in them, and they cost a great deal. But stands about this high, and it will hold 100 pounds of wheat. Very difficult to pick up because it's long. And then my father would take this 100-pound bag of wheat, and he would place it in the trunk of the car, and we would go to Kalamazoo. I'll talk about in the future, maybe Kalamazoo on $1 a day in 1943, something of that type. But either way, go to Kalamazoo, and you leave with this 100-pound bag of wheat in the rear of your 40 Ford. Can't replace the 40 Ford. Only went to 41, and the only people who had 42s were doctors and dealers. stopped making automobiles, they're busy making tanks, planes, and other things. So my father had the wheat, and we would drive to Kalamazoo for shopping during the day. On the way there, we would stop at a grist mill, and the grist mill ground commercially for any number of people, but we knew the individual very well and had known the family for years. It was about 7 miles from our house. We would stop in front of the grist mill. My father would take the 100 pounds of wheat out, and then he would carry it in and give it to the man who ran the grist mill. Very, very nice fellow, who was always dressed in white and always had flour all over his eyebrows. And then, when we returned from Kalamazoo, about 3:30 in the afternoon, 3:45, my father would stop there again. At that time, he would pick up a heavy paper bag with 50 pounds of bread flour. Now, it wasn't necessarily the same wheat, but either way, it didn't cost anything. 100 pounds of wheat, 50 pounds of flour, even exchange for the services. And then he would bring that home, which means my mother could go to town from time to time, and the only thing she would purchase essential to our eating, rather than magazines and other things you might purchase, candy, peanuts, or something like that, would be yeast. And yeast was very, very essential. My mother baked every Friday, and she attempted to bake enough for the whole family for the whole week. And when I say Friday, she baked, well, that's bread. There are other days in which she would be baking pies, muffins, and other things. And then she mixed up in a, again, almost the size of a tub, a pan, huge. She'd mix up the dough, prepare it, and set it next to the not too hot part of the cook stove, which still operated under wood, and it would rise. And then she would make it into rolls in metal pans, so that loaves of bread would be this long, this wide, and they would puff over and spill out over the sides. And she would make about 10 loaves of bread, some on one rack, some on the other, and then there would be one large tray of biscuits, so that there'd be more than enough for the Friday night meal with 8 people eating, so that you had some biscuits left over that you might slice and toast, other things, for a breakfast on another day. But the homemade bread was very, very good, very heavy and very filling. Nothing quite like toasting homemade bread, putting the peanut butter on. When the bread's so hot, the peanut butter gets a little malleable, and it's very, very good. That would happen every Friday, and on that particular Friday, my mother would not use the oven for making a roast or something like that. The space was already taken, as you can see. And there were actually 4 lids that she could take off the stove where the heat came out this way, but on one end was where the wood went in. And of course the woodshed was just out and down the door. So she would bake, and all of that was done, and she'd set it out for that to cool. And then to keep it, because we didn't have room to refrigerate anything like that, she would wrap it in linen dish towels and place it in the pantry. But it would be consumed by the next Thursday. If we ran out on a Wednesday, then we might purchase some bread from the store, which was not favored by us, and because the bread tasted so good and was so nourishing and so filling. And another advantage, I always took my lunch to school. And we talked about the one-room country school, and so you always took something to school, even if there's something hot was delivered by one of the parents to the school. It was scalloped potatoes, baked beans, or something of this type. And so my mother always baked plenty, and the Friday night meal was always navy beans with ham hocks, chowder-type cabbage salad, and homemade biscuits. That was a standard Friday night meal the day you bake. You want the biscuits when they're fresh. Now, we would slice the bread, and I would take a sandwich to school, and the sandwich could be this big in circumference, and then on bread, very thick bread, so very, very nourishing and very, very filling. The advantage was that we seemed to be the only family at that time at the one-room country school who was still baking all of our own bread. And I could very easily swap at least half the sandwich for somebody's pie or cookies or something of that type, because they wanted the bread and they only had store-purchased bread at home, and they would seek out ways of eating my mother's bread. So, some special times on the farm. about 1939 to 1943, 1945. We'll end at that point, and there's every possibility we may come back again and talk with you about developments in rural Michigan about 1940, close to Kalamazoo, and maybe some of the conditions of wartime, how rationing affects a young person, and other things of that type. Thank you.